The Room of Lost Voices. Chapter 1. Return. Lea Becker arrived in Wuppertal on a cold morning in early March. The sky was gray, and the air smelled like wet stone. She stepped off the train with a small suitcase and a leather bag filled with notebooks, pencils, and her camera. She had come alone, as she often did. Lea liked silence. She liked to work without distractions. She was 28 years old, a student of architecture, and this was her final project before graduation. Her thesis was about forgotten places, buildings that once held life but were now empty. She believed that architecture could tell stories, even when no one was left to speak. She had visited old factories, train stations, and schools. But this time, she had chosen something different. She had chosen an abandoned psychiatric hospital on the edge of the city. The hospital had been closed for more than 30 years. A fire in 1952 had destroyed part of the building, and after that, it was never reopened. People in Wuppertal didn't talk about it much. Some said it was cursed. Others said it was just dangerous. But Lea didn't believe in curses. She believed in history. She believed that every wall, every hallway, every broken window had something to say. She took a taxi to the edge of the forest. The road was narrow and cracked. Trees leaned over the path, their branches bare. When the car stopped, she saw the building in the distance. It stood on a small hill, surrounded by trees. The roof was broken in places, and ivy covered the stone walls. The windows were dark, like empty eyes. Lea thanked the driver and walked up the hill. The ground was soft with old leaves. Her boots made no sound. As she reached the front steps, she paused. The door was still there, heavy and wooden, with rusted hinges. She pushed it open. It creaked, but it moved. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust floated in the light from the broken windows. The floor was covered in dirt and pieces of plaster. Old furniture stood in corners, beds, chairs, metal cabinets. Everything was quiet. But Lea didn't feel afraid. She felt calm, almost welcome. She began her work. She took photos of the entrance, the staircases, the long hallways. She made sketches of the building's structure. She wrote notes about the materials, the layout, the signs of fire damage. She moved slowly, room by room, careful not to step on weak boards. She wore gloves and a scarf, but her fingers were still cold. In one hallway, she found a door that was slightly open. She pushed it gently and stepped inside. It was a small room with peeling wallpaper and a broken chair. The window was cracked, and the wind made a soft sound. She stood still, listening. Then she heard it. A whisper. It was soft, like breath. It came from the corner of the room. She turned, but no one was there. The sound came again. It was not loud, but it was clear. It sounded like her name. Lea. She froze. Her heart beat faster. She waited, but the sound did not return. She looked around the room. There was nothing unusual. Just dust, broken glass, and silence. She left the room and continued her work, but something had changed. She felt watched. Not in a dangerous way, but in a quiet, curious way. As if the building had noticed her. That night, She stayed in a small guest house in the city. She looked through her photos and notes. Everything seemed normal. But she couldn't stop thinking about the whisper. She told herself it was the wind or her imagination. But deep down, she wasn't sure. Lea had come to Wuppertal to study a building. But now, she felt the building was studying her. And something inside it was waiting to be found. Chapter 2. Whispers. Lea returned to the hospital the next morning. The sky was pale, and the forest around the building was quiet. She walked up the hill with her camera and notebook, ready to continue her work. The air inside the building was colder than before, and the dust seemed to hang heavier in the light. She moved carefully through the halls, taking photos of broken doors, cracked ceilings, and faded signs. But her thoughts were not only on architecture anymore. She kept thinking about the whisper she had heard. It had sounded like her name, soft and close. She had told herself it was the wind, or maybe her imagination. But now, as she walked through the empty rooms, she began to hear more sounds. They were quiet, like breath against a wall. Sometimes they came from behind her, sometimes from the next room. They were not loud, but they were clear. She stopped and listened. The words were hard to understand at first. Some were in German, others in Latin. She recognized a few phrases. One voice said, "They forgot us." Another whispered, "We are still here." The voices were not angry. They sounded tired, like people who had waited too long to be heard. Lea began writing the phrases in her notebook. She didn't know why, but she felt it was important. She wrote the date, the time, and the location of each whisper. She tried to find patterns, but the voices came without warning. Sometimes they repeated. Sometimes they changed. But they always felt close. She searched the building for clues. In one room, she found old papers scattered on the floor. Most were burned or torn, but one folder was still readable. It contained patient records from the early 1950s. She read through the names and notes, looking for anything unusual. One name stood out, Elsa Mertens. The file said she was admitted in 1951 and disappeared the night of the fire. No body was found. No explanation was given. Lea felt a chill. She looked around the room, wondering if Elsa had once stood there. She imagined the fire, the panic, the silence that followed. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in memory. She believed that places could hold emotion, like walls holding heat. Maybe the whispers were pieces of memory, trapped in the building. She continued her work, but her focus had changed. She still took photos and made sketches, but now she listened more. She paused in each room, waiting for the voices. She didn't feel afraid. She felt curious. She wanted to understand what the building was trying to say. At night, back in her guest house, she reviewed her notes. The phrases repeated again and again. They forgot us. We are still here. She wondered who they were. Doctors? Families? The world outside? She didn't know. But she felt the voices were speaking to her for a reason. Lea began to dream of the hospital. In her sleep, she walked through the halls, following whispers. She saw shadows moving behind doors. She heard names she didn't recognize. She woke up feeling tired but full of questions. She wrote down everything she remembered. The next day, she returned to the hospital with a small recorder. She placed it in the rooms where the whispers were strongest. She hoped to capture the sounds, to study them later. But when she listened to the recordings, there was nothing. Only silence. The voices didn't want to be caught. They wanted to be heard in the moment. Lea didn't give up. She kept listening, writing, and searching. She felt the building was alive in a way she had never felt before. It was not just stone and wood. It was a place full of stories waiting to be told. And somewhere deep inside, she felt that Elsa's story was one of them. Chapter 3. Felix. Lea had spent several days inside the hospital, walking through its broken halls and listening to the whispers. She had collected strange phrases, old names, and fragments of memory. But she needed more. She wanted to speak to someone who had known the building when it was still alive. She asked around in the city, mostly in quiet cafes and small shops. Most people didn't want to talk about the hospital. Some looked away. Others changed the subject. But one name came up more than once: Felix Gruber. Felix had worked as a security guard at the hospital many years ago. He was one of the last people to leave before the fire. Now he lived alone in a small wooden house near the edge of the forest. People said he was strange, quiet, and didn't like visitors. But Lea was curious. She found his address and walked there one afternoon. The house was old but clean. It stood between tall trees with a small garden in front. Lea knocked on the door and waited. At first, no one answered. Then the door opened slowly. Felix stood there, tall and thin, with gray hair and tired eyes. He looked at her without speaking. Lea introduced herself and said she was studying the hospital. She asked if he would talk to her. Felix didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the house was simple. There were books, old photographs, and a radio playing soft music. He made tea and sat down across from her. His hands were rough, and his face showed years of silence. At first, Felix spoke little. He said the hospital had been a strange place. He remembered the long nights, the quiet halls, and the patients who never slept. He said the building had always felt heavy, like it was holding something inside. Lea asked about the fire, but he didn't want to talk about it. Instead, he told her about the voices. He said he had heard them too. Not just once, but many times. Late at night, when the halls were empty, he would hear whispers. They came from the walls, from the floors, sometimes from behind closed doors. He thought it was his imagination, but the voices never stopped. They said things he didn't understand. They called out names. They cried without sound. Felix told her about one room that was always locked. It was in the lower part of the hospital, near the old storage area. No one went there. The staff avoided it. The patients feared it. He called it the Room of Lost Voices. He said it had been used for something else, something not written in the records. Rumors said experiments were done there, not with medicine, but with memory and sound. Lea listened carefully. She asked if he had ever entered the room. Felix said no. He had stood outside it many times, but the door was always locked. He said the air near it felt wrong, like it was too still. He had once seen a doctor leave the room looking pale and shaken. After that, the room was sealed. No one spoke of it again. Lea felt a chill. She asked where the room was. Felix gave her directions, slowly and clearly. He warned her not to go. He said the voices were not just sounds. They were pieces of people, trapped and waiting. He said the room didn't forget. It remembered everything. Lea thanked him and left. She walked back through the forest, thinking about his words. She didn't feel afraid. She felt drawn to the room. She wanted to find it, to understand it, to listen to what it had to say. The next morning, she returned to the hospital. She followed Felix's directions through the lower halls. The air grew colder. The light faded. She found the door. It was metal with a rusted lock. She touched it gently. Behind it, she felt silence, deep and full. Lea knew she had found the room of lost voices. And she knew she would open it. Chapter 4. The Room. Lea stood in front of the metal door. It was cold to the touch and covered in rust. The lock had broken long ago, but the door still felt heavy, as if it didn't want to be opened. The hallway around her was quiet. The air was thick and still. She took a deep breath and pushed the door slowly. It opened with a loud creak. Inside, the room was dark. Only a small window near the ceiling let in a little light. Dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts. The walls were stained and cracked. Old beds stood against one side, their frames bent and rusted. On the other side were chairs with leather straps, the kind used to hold people down. The straps were torn, but still there. The room smelled like metal and old paper. Lea stepped inside. Her boots made soft sounds on the floor. She looked around carefully. On the walls, she saw words scratched into the paint. Some were names. Some were short messages. One said, "I am still here." Another said, "Don't forget me." The writing was uneven, like it had been done in pain or fear. As she moved deeper into the room, the whispers returned. They were louder now, not just soft sounds in the distance. They filled the space around her. They came from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. They sounded like begging, like people asking for help. Some voices cried. Others repeated the same words again and again. Lea felt her heart beat faster. She tried to stay calm. She took out her notebook and began to write. But her hand shook. The whispers grew stronger. They didn't speak to her directly, but they filled her mind. She felt a sharp pain in her head, like pressure building behind her eyes. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then the images came. She saw faces. Not clear, but real enough to feel. A woman with wide eyes, a boy holding a blanket, an old man with a broken smile. She saw scenes. A hallway full of shadows. A doctor writing notes. A patient screaming without sound. The images came fast, like flashes of memory. They were not hers. They belonged to someone else. Or maybe to many people. Lea opened her eyes and looked around. The room was the same, but it felt different. It felt full. Not with objects, but with emotion. She felt sadness, fear, and something deeper, something like loneliness. She understood that this room had held more than bodies. It had held pain. And that pain had stayed. She sat down on one of the beds. The metal was cold. She listened to the whispers. They didn't stop, but they changed. Some became softer. Some faded. She felt like the room was watching her, waiting to see what she would do. Lea didn't run. She didn't scream. She stayed. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know why the voices were still here. She believed they had something to say, something that had never been heard. She stayed in the room for a long time. She wrote down everything she saw and heard. She didn't speak, but she listened. And slowly, the voices began to feel less like noise and more like stories. When she finally stood up to leave, the whispers followed her to the door. They didn't beg anymore. They just stayed close, like shadows walking beside her. Lea stepped out into the hallway. The air felt lighter. She looked back at the room. It was still dark, still broken. But now she knew it was more than a room. It was a memory. A voice. A place that had waited too long to be heard. And she had heard it. Chapter 5. Descent. Lea Becker returned to her guest house after visiting the Room of Lost Voices. Her body felt heavy, and her mind was full of strange thoughts. She tried to rest, but sleep did not come. Her dreams were filled with faces she had never seen and voices she could not forget. When she closed her eyes, she saw the scratched words on the walls. When she opened them, she still heard whispers. The next morning, she skipped breakfast. Her appetite was gone. She sat by the window with her notebook, but her hands did not move. Her thoughts were slow and tangled. She tried to read her notes from the day before, but the words looked strange, as if someone else had written them. She felt tired, but not from work. It was a deeper kind of tiredness, like her mind was carrying something too heavy. She walked through the city, hoping fresh air would help. But even outside the hospital, the voices followed her. They were softer now, but still there. She heard them in the wind, in the sound of passing cars, even in the quiet of the park. They whispered names, short phrases, and sometimes just breathed. She looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. Lea began to feel pain in her chest and head. It was not sharp, but constant. It felt like sadness, but not her own. She wondered if the voices were giving her their memories, their feelings. She didn't know how to stop it. She didn't want to stop it. She felt pulled towards something she didn't understand. She returned to the hospital again, even though her body begged for rest. She walked through the halls slowly, touching the walls, listening. The building felt more alive than ever. The whispers were stronger. They filled every corner. She felt like she was walking inside someone's mind. Later that day, she went back to Felix Gruber's house. He opened the door and looked at her with concern. Her face was pale, and her eyes looked distant. She told him what was happening. She said the voices were everywhere now, not just in the room. She said she felt pain that didn't belong to her. Felix listened quietly. Then he spoke with a serious tone. He said others had entered that room before. Some were doctors, some were curious visitors. Many of them had changed afterward. Some became silent. Some lost their minds. He said the room was not just a place, it was a trap for memory. It held voices that wanted to be heard, but also wanted to stay. He begged her to leave Wuppertal and forget the hospital. But Lea couldn't. She felt a deep need to finish what she had started. She believed the voices had chosen her. She believed they wanted her to tell their story. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to try. Felix looked at her with sadness. He said he had once tried to help the voices too. But he had failed. He said the pain was too strong. He warned her again, but she thanked him and left. That night, Lea sat in her room with her notebook open. She wrote slowly, trying to organize her thoughts. She wrote down every whisper she could remember. She wrote the names, the feelings, the images. Her handwriting was shaky, but her focus was strong. She didn't sleep. She didn't eat. But she felt closer to the truth. She felt like the voices were guiding her. She didn't know where it would lead, but she was ready to follow. Lea had started her journey as a student of architecture. Now, she was something else. She was a listener. A witness. A bridge between silence and memory. And the descent had only begun. Chapter 6. The Truth. Lea returned to the hospital with a new purpose. She no longer came only to study the building. She came to understand the voices. The whispers had become part of her daily life. They followed her in dreams and in silence. She felt their sadness, their confusion, and their need to be heard. She believed they were not trying to scare her. They were trying to speak. She began searching deeper into the hospital. She explored rooms she had not entered before. In one of the old offices, behind a broken cabinet, she found a wooden box covered in dust. Inside were several notebooks, a few audio tapes, and a nameplate that read, Drive. H. Weiss. The handwriting on the notebooks was small and neat. The pages were yellow with age. Lea took the box back to her guest house. She cleaned the tapes and borrowed a tape player from the local library. That night, she sat at her desk and pressed play. The voice on the tape was calm and cold. It belonged to Dr. Weiss. He spoke about his work with the patients. He believed that trauma could be removed from the mind if it was spoken enough times. He called it vocal cleansing. He described his method in detail. He would ask patients to repeat their worst memories again and again. He believed that by speaking the pain, they could release it. But the tapes told a different story. The patients did not heal. They became weaker. Some stopped speaking. Others screamed until they lost their voices. A few died in their beds, silent and empty. In his journal, Drive, Weiss wrote that he had failed. But he also wrote something strange. He said the voices of the patients had not disappeared. He believed they had stayed in the room. He wrote, their words are still here. They echo in the walls. The room remembers them. It holds their pain. Lea read every page. She listened to every tape. The more she learned, the more she understood. The whispers were not ghosts. They were not spirits from another world. They were the remains of human suffering. The voices were memories, trapped in the space where they were spoken. The room had absorbed them, like a sponge absorbs water. It was not haunted. It was full of memory. She thought about the scratched words on the walls. She thought about the faces she had seen in her visions. They were not trying to harm her. They were trying to be remembered. They were trying to be free. Lea felt a deep sadness. These people had been forgotten. Their pain had been locked away, hidden behind a metal door. No one had listened. No one had cared. Until now. She realized that the room was not cursed. It was a place of silence that had waited too long to be broken. The voices had waited for someone to hear them. Someone who would not run. Someone who would stay. Lea knew she had to do something. She could not leave the voices behind. She had to give them a way to speak again. She had to tell their story. She began writing everything down. She copied the doctor's notes. She described the room in detail. She wrote about the whispers, the pain, and the memories. She wanted to create a record that would last. A record that would not be hidden or forgotten. As she wrote, the whispers in her mind began to change. They became softer, less urgent. Some faded completely. Others repeated words of thanks. She felt a shift in the air, as if the room itself had taken a breath. Lea understood now. The voices did not want revenge. They wanted peace. They wanted someone to carry their truth into the world. And she would. Chapter 7. Resolution. Lea Becker returned to the hospital one last time. The sky was gray, and the wind moved slowly through the trees. She carried a small recorder in her bag and a folder filled with names and notes. Her steps were quiet as she walked through the empty halls. The building felt different now. It was still broken, still cold, but something inside it had changed. She reached the lower level and stood in front of the metal door. The rust was darker, and the air around it was still. She opened the door slowly and stepped into the room of lost voices. The dust floated in the light, and the old beds and chairs stood like forgotten statues. The whispers returned, soft and steady. They filled the room like breath. Lea sat on the edge of one of the beds. She placed the recorder on her lap and pressed the button. The red light blinked. She began to speak. Her voice was calm, but her heart was full. She spoke to the room, to the voices, to the memories trapped in the walls. She said she had heard them. She said she had listened. She read the names she had found in the archives: Elsa Mertens, Jakob Klein, Anna Vogel, and many more. She spoke each name slowly, with care. She said they were not forgotten. She said their pain had been felt. She said their stories mattered. The whispers changed. They grew quieter, softer, almost peaceful. Some faded completely. Others repeated words of thanks. Lea felt the air shift. It was like the room had taken a breath, like it had waited for this moment. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of release. She stayed for a while, letting the quiet settle. Then she turned off the recorder and stood up. She looked around the room one last time. It was still dark, still damaged, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt lighter, like something had been lifted. Lea walked out of the hospital slowly. Her body was tired, but her mind was clear. She had come to study a building, but she had found something deeper. She had found voices that needed to be heard, and she had given them space to speak. Back in her guest house, she finished her thesis. It was not just about architecture anymore. It was about memory, silence, and the power of listening. She wrote about the hospital, the room, the voices, and the truth she had discovered. Her words were simple, but strong. A few weeks later, the building was demolished. The city had planned it for years. Lea watched from a distance as the walls came down. She didn't feel sad. She felt ready. She knew the room had not vanished in vain. It had spoken. It had been heard. Lea moved away from Wuppertal and started a new chapter in her life. She continued her work, but she never forgot the hospital. She never forgot the whispers. She kept the recorder and the notes in a box, safe and quiet. She knew that memory does not disappear. Even when bodies are gone, pain can remain. But if it is heard, it can leave. Sometimes, to be free, we just need to be heard. Moral: memory does not disappear. Even when bodies are gone, pain can remain. But if it is heard, it can leave. Sometimes, to be free, we just need to be heard. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.